Okay, we are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brett Kerwin. I'm Vice Chair of the AIB. I'm standing in for the moment for our chair, Ike Leggett, who is going to join us a little later today during the session. But I am joined by all the others of the AIB. And I want those of you who are live streaming this session, just wanted to remind you this is a regular AIB board meeting. It's not one of the work sessions that we've been holding over the course of the summer. With that, I will turn to our Executive Director, Rachel, to introduce the agenda for this session.
Thank you. So today we only have one agenda item for the public session, which is further discussion of the draft comprehensive plan. As the vice chair mentioned, we've been holding a number of working sessions throughout the summer and early fall to develop the draft plan. And we are very close to releasing the draft to the public for additional review and comment. And so Emma, if you could put the PowerPoint presentation up, that would be great. We'll just kind of walk through. We have a number of documents and materials just to walk through with you. So as you all know, the AIB must adopt a final comprehensive plan by December 1 of this year. And that plan will guide the implementation of the blueprint and also will provide information for what all the other entities that are responsible for implementing the blueprint, state agencies, local education agencies, and others, what they will need to include in their blueprint implementation plans that will be submitted to the AIB for review and approval on March 15th of 2023. We have an outline of the plan that we want to share with you. And so I guess we're kind of going to go back and forth between documents here. So we'll share the outline. And so you can see that, there we go. So this is a draft outline for the plan, and the first few sections are sort of all the standard things. Section 4.
Rachel,
yes.
The first thing is the transmittal letter. Who is it transmitted to?
The blueprint plan is submitted to the governor and general assembly.
I see. Okay, that was part of the blueprint legislation.
Yeah, exactly. But we will be, of course, also sharing it on our website, and and also actually printing hard copies of it, I think, is the plan. So the section 4 then is sort of starts to get into the meat of it, and you can see next to sections 1, 2, and 3 it says final draft. So those sections that say final draft are not going to be released right now in October. They'll be just part of the final draft. So section 4, it really starts to get into the substance of the blueprint and why we have it, what it entails, what it requires, and how it will be implemented. And a lot of this material is already on the AIB's website in various places, as well as parts of it are in the commission reports. So we're not really necessarily going to be creating new ground. We're just going to try to summarize it so that the plan itself kind of will stand as a document. Below that, you see blueprint goals and expected outcomes, and then blueprint outcome measures at full implementation. So these are sections that we discussed somewhat briefly at the last meeting. It was actually a long meeting, but we presented some draft expected outcomes of the blueprint, which is of course a requirement of the law for the AIB to identify the expected outcomes of the blueprint, and then also the outcome measures that will be used to judge whether the outcomes have been achieved. And we had a draft of that for you last week at full implementation, and so those materials will become part of the initial draft of the plan that is released in the next week or two.
So Rachel, when you say, like in the third bullet under pillar 1, targets to be determined, would they be in the initial draft, the targets?
You've jumped ahead,
I'm
but
sorry.
that's okay. That's all right. So section 6, which is what you're referring to,
Right.
That is like the main content of the plan.
Right.
And so the pillar outcome measures, expected outcomes and outcome measures, we shared some drafts of those expected outcomes at the last meeting, and are still are working on those right now. And so what the targets are, I'm sorry, Emma, keeps moving around there. Can you scroll down, please? There we go. Great. So the targets are the actual expected, quantifiable expected outcome at certain points along the way of implementation. So how we're going to measure progress. Right. And so for right now, we are going to, we're still developing those. And in many cases, we need baseline data to be able to determine how to get from where we're starting to where we know we want to be. So it's pretty easy, not easy, but it's doable to set what the expectation is at full implementation. But until we have a good sense of where we're starting from, it's hard to set intermediate goals or targets. And so that process is something that we're going to need to continue working on and see how far we can get to be included in the final draft. It may be that some of that will come as part of the update to the plan. Under the law, the AIB obviously can update the plan each year, and it has to be updated before August 1st, I believe, in the law. So we will have an opportunity to, this is going to be a living document. We're not going to change things, sort of like change the rules, so to speak, but there will need to be updates to the plan along the way, I'm sure. So we're going to get into section 6 a little more in a few minutes, but essentially the idea is to release the initial draft of section 6, which covers the 5 pillars, and then section 7, which covers the implementation considerations and technical assistance. We talked about that also at the last meeting. The findings from the feedback from the work sessions that identified implementation considerations that the AIB has identified to monitor closely, and then also the technical assistance and supports that are that we've gotten feedback around that are important to support the LEAs and the other entities implementing the blueprint. And then the last bullet there, identify any recommended legislative changes. That actually, I think at the moment, that will not be included in the initial draft. But that would be something that would come in the final draft. And then, and so 6 and 7, we're planning to, we're working very, very hard to release that next week, those sections of the draft next week.
That's the initial draft you're talking.
The initial draft, right?
Right.
For public review and comment, exactly.
Right, and just roughly, when would the final draft be? Would that be the document that would come to the board for approval on December 1st?
Yes. So, Emma, I'm going to ask you to just go back to the PowerPoint, if you would. Great.
Oh, this is helpful.
Okay, I think maybe this is a little more helpful. So, so as I was saying, section 6 and 7, we're aiming to release those next week. By the end of the month, we've been working with MSDE at the staff level to discuss the draft criteria for success and the template that MSDE submitted and discussed at the last meeting. So we've been working with the staff, going through that and working on revising that with them, and hope to have that done by the end of the month, so that we would release a revised version of those 2 documents for public review and comment. And then the other sections would be in the final plan. And the final plan, Mr. Manko, I see your hand up. Let me just get to real quickly. The public hearing will be on November 10th, and that is the next scheduled meeting of the AIB. Then there is a meeting on November 17th where we would discuss feedback from the public hearing and changes that that staff might suggest, that you all might suggest, and we would have the final draft of the whole plan to work on, to then adopt at the next meeting, which is December 1st. Hopefully that was clear. Mr. Manko?
So I think this got covered a little bit when we were talking about the public hearing, but I was just, my question was really for the public that's going to be looking and reviewing this draft plan that gets launched next week. What are the mechanisms for providing feedback? And then what specifically, in terms of feedback, would you be looking for that would be more helpful to, continuing to refine the document?
Sure. So Emma, would you just skip forward to slide 5? There we go. The public hearing will be on November 10th, and we are going to have, in addition to that public hearing opportunity, there will also be a feedback form, similar but different than the one we were using during the working sessions. That will allow, and it will be on the AIB website, it will allow anyone to provide comments or questions about the draft plan, and any of the pillars. They can submit more than one form, so there's no limit. So we will welcome all of that feedback. I think we're going to walk through an example of what a pillar section is going to look like. And I think it would be helpful to specifically get feedback on whether the format that we're proposing in the draft is helpful, if there are things that are missing, if there are items that they feel like they need more guidance on, and then also any feedback on the proposed, and I'll draft out expected outcomes and outcome measures. A lot of the material, as you'll see in a minute, is really mostly already in the implementation graphics that we've been using to develop the plan in the working sessions, but we've tried to present it in hopefully a way that sort of connects the dots a little more, and helps folks think of it kind of holistically and not just sort of task oriented. But we will also be including, at least at the moment, we're thinking we will still include the original updated graphics in the plan as well. Because I do think it's a helpful visual tool of kind of the big picture.
So are you ready to move on, Rachel?
Yeah, so why don't we
Yeah, just before you do, let me ask my colleagues if they're comfortable with this proposed schedule. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm just looking to see if there's anyone who wants to comment on that. So I assume that this then everyone feels okay with that, with the schedule you've laid out, Rachel.
we can certainly keep going, and
Yeah.
there as questions or thoughts come
Right.
up. So if you just go to the next slide, Emma, you were asking about the blueprint, the expected outcomes. So the outcomes that are in the draft, what we've done is we've identified outcomes that are student-centered, that will be measurable and will impact student development and student achievement. And we have expected outcomes for the blueprint overall, sort of the big systemic goals, and for each pillar. And as I was saying earlier, and those are at full implementation of the blueprint. Then the outcome measures that will actually be used to track progress towards the expected outcomes. We also have those in draft form for the blueprint overall, for each pillar, and then for each pillar objective. So as we kind of drill down in the document and in the graphic. And then the items that are still under development, and so will not be released in the initial draft, are outcome measures below the objective level. So as we get into the specific tasks and subtasks that are part of each pillar, we do not currently have outcome measures identified for those. And it won't make sense for all of them, but for some of them it does. And so we have been working with our consultants at NCEE to develop those for review. But we're still in progress on that. And then, as the vice chair was asking about the targets, we do not have targets yet. The only targets that we do have are those that are in the law, that are required by law. For example, that all low-income 4-year-olds who wish to enroll in full-day pre-K under the law have to be served by fiscal 26. So that's an example of a target, but it's also a requirement of the law. And I see Dr. Doss has her hand up.
Thank you, Rachel. How are we employing or integrating all of that wonderful information that we gained from the summer comprehensive sessions into the implementation plan? And I know that's kind of a general question, but I just think it's something that that folks will be interested in hearing.
Absolutely, yes. So at the last meeting, what we did is we reviewed all of the feedback that we received from the summer sessions, and identified specific feedback that was being incorporated into the plan, into the implementation graphic. And then we identified other comments, questions, considerations that were raised during the sessions, but that were not necessarily ready to be incorporated into the plan, that need to be monitored. And so those are the kinds of things that will be in section 7 of the report, the implementation considerations. So there are a good amount of feedback that's already been incorporated into those implementation graphics. Then additional implementation considerations that will be part of the plan. They'll be in section 7. They'll be identified as items to be, actively monitored by the AIB to determine whether something needs to be done differently, essentially, and whether additional support and technical assistance can be helpful to the implementation. And section 7 also will include technical assistance topics that were raised during the working sessions that would be helpful to LEAs and other entities who are working to implement section or pieces of the blueprint pillars. And we could, if it's helpful, we weren't planning to do this, but we can certainly, if it's helpful, we could share that again with you all, but we can put it on the screen if it's helpful. So let me know.
Okay, no, that's good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Dr. Stapleton?
Yes, Rachel, thank you. And I appreciate this conversation starting to talk about technical assistance, because I think as soon as comprehensive plan gets laid out, it's going to be very clear where LEAs will want technical assistance. And I don't know if you're prepared to talk about this at this time, but where are we in terms of having access to a budget or a hiring process to support technical assistance?
Sure. So we are very, very close to having access to our budget. So I am very hopeful that by the end of this month we will have access to the budget specifically. We are able to do business with folks who are willing to wait to be paid, and so that's what we've been doing up to this point. So it will be good to be able to start to function like a proper agency and engage folks, and we're also going to be recruiting for the additional positions this fall. So the goal is to fill as many of the positions as we can by the end of the calendar year. But that's very important, but we're still going to be able to move forward with providing technical assistance and we have been talking with MSDE about what joint technical assistance sessions we can offer to start to really bring folks together to, one of the things that I found just in some of the convenings we've done already is just the actual convening of the LEAs and different teacher preparation institutions and programs, CFOs, blueprint coordinators. I mean, these things are happening now jointly with MSDE and AIB. And I think just just those convenings and discussing the implementation and asking questions and asking for guidance or additional expertise has already been, I think, helpful. And so at least from AIB's perspective, I think that is what we would like to do is, based on different topic areas, do convenings like that where we could tap into experts that we would identify that can provide some innovative ideas for how to implement pieces of the blueprint, best practices, and just kind of try to tackle different topics, starting as soon as we can this fall.
Hey, Rachel, just as a follow-up, and you've sort of touched on it, but in general terms, what will be the source of the technical assistance? I mean, where will people, who will the experts be? I just in general, where are we going to find the people to provide this technical assistance, and how will LEAs or the CTE board, how will they tap into this technical assistance? Will there be RFPs, or how's all this going to work?
So I think the technical assistance might look different. There'll be different levels of technical assistance. Maybe
Right.
That's a good way to put it. And so one level, maybe the higher level, is these convenings where we would bring experts in the field. So, for example, if we were lucky enough to be able to, bring Linda Darling Hammond in to speak with LEAs and folks within the school systems around, and the union folks and others involved in the career ladder development, to talk about sort of goals for how to develop a functional career ladder that really can stand the test of time, and some of the pitfalls that the few career ladders that have been attempted in the US, there are still a few that are functioning very well, but for the most part, they've run into hiccups, and they haven't been sustainable. And so, how to build it something that can be sustainable. So depending on the topic, we would look to different experts in the field, either in academia or out in the real world, so to speak. Same with for example, community schools. There are various organizations that are very focused on effective implementation of the community school model, that I think we could tap into those folks to share their best advice with the LEAs and with the existing community schools. And then another level of technical assistance could be, and as you say, potentially through some RFPs, identifying organizations that LEAs or state entities could work with specifically as they're developing their plans, if they have questions, or if they need assistance with very specific kinds of questions. And I think we would probably try to coordinate that at the AIB and MSDE levels, so that we're making sure that we understand what the LEAs need, and we can try to match them with the right people to help them.
Thank you.
But very good questions, and as the saying goes, as we're continuing to build the plane and fly it at the same time, we need to start to really plan more specifically what this technical assistance, how we're going to pull it together. Absolutely. So the next slide is on the blueprint pillars. So I've said most of this, I think, but essentially, section 6 of the plan is gonna have the 5 pillars. And while we still have the implementation graphics and we're gonna continue to use those, what we've tried to do is organize all the information that is in those graphics sort of in a logical sequence that helps everyone, the public, stakeholders, and especially those who have to implement the blueprint, to think kind of deliberatively about how to develop their plan, as they're developing their plan, what they need to be considering to make sure is part of it to meet the implementation requirements of the blueprint. And so for each pillar, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the plan will have, again, we'll identify the pillar, the outcomes and outcome measures at the pillar and objective level. There are milestones and deliverables. There are, we've got a separate table showing required reports that are are part of, not necessarily part of the plan, but that have to be submitted on the blueprint. And then the major subtasks and requirements. I think the best thing, if you all are ready to do this, would be to show you the example, the draft of pillar 1 that we've been working on, so that everyone can see what it looks like, and we can sort of walk through it a little bit.
Good.
Great. And also, you all have these documents, and they're also posted on the website. Thank you. A little bigger would be great. That's okay. So here we have pillar 1, and you can see for the description, we'll have a good description of what falls under pillar 1, but early childhood education, as we know. And then the first item is the expected outcome of the pillar. And so if thinking about at the last meeting, we talked about what are the overarching goals of the blueprint. And ultimately, the goal is we want every student, no matter where in the state they're born or into what circumstances, by the end of high school, to be college and career ready, and as many as possible to be college and career ready by the end of 10th grade. So they have those post CCR pathway opportunities while they're still in high school, to get on a path for the rest of high school. And once they leave high school, and either go into a career or into a post-secondary education. So that's sort of our big overarching goal. And each of the pillars has various policies within it that are supporting getting to that overall goal. And so for pillar 1, the expected outcome, and again, this is a draft, is that students come to kindergarten ready to learn, that they come in the door on track for CCR, essentially, in kindergarten. And that includes developmentally ready and also physical, social, and emotional health. Here, it says nearly all. Obviously, we want, all students, we want all students to be ready when they enter school. But we don't want to fall necessarily into the pitfall of setting a goal that is not achievable. And so that is why it says nearly all. Ultimately, we will need to say what that means. And that's the target. That's one of the that's the target for the pillar outcome. And what nearly all constitutes? I see lots of hands, so let's see. I don't know who raised their hand first, so
Well, I did, but I realize I'm jumping ahead to the outcome measures. And it's a very minor thing, but I wondered
that's okay.
about, I wondered about using the phrase year 10 instead of making a specific year, because I think year 10 may mean different things to different people.
I think that's a really fair point. That sort of commission speak, for lack of a better way to put it. We worked in not the actual years, but just the number of years. So absolutely. And so in this case, year 10, at least based on the timeline that we've been using in the pillar graphics, would be fiscal 32 or the 2031-2032 school year. Is year 10. Now that may or may not be the year we want to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would be clear for the public to have a specific year listed instead of year 10. But
yeah,
that's very minor.
No, that's helpful. Mr. Manco?
I think Britt was first, so.
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay.
Go ahead, Joe.
So I remember you saying, Rachel, that the outcome measures are going to continue to get built out because they'll be informed by baseline data. So I just wanted to get a sense, like, for example, on these outcome measures, when what's the mechanism for how we obtain that baseline data, and then when do we presume that this will be kind of populated so we have a sense of what our starting point is, and then ultimately where we want to be in 10 years, and then like incrementally what this means for the goals that we're setting year to year in terms of the percentage of students that are, demonstrating readiness on the KRA or whatever other metrics we have.
So in some cases, the data is available now, and it's just a matter of compiling it and then analyzing it to support developing the actual targets, both for the full implementation and along the way for progress. In many cases, it's data that we're going to need to that isn't necessarily collected regularly, and so this is one of the so for the KRA data that exists now. It is reported annually, and MSDE analyzes the disaggregated data. So that is an example where we would be able to look at that data and sort of start to think about what progress looks like. I think the challenge is that the more recent data isn't available yet, and the pandemic has really affected assessment results. And so we could certainly look at data from before the pandemic, so 2019 data, but I'm not sure that sets a realistic baseline for where we really are now with the pandemic. And so the KRA is actually, I think that October 10th is the date when the KRA is supposed to be completed for all kindergartners this year. And so the data from the from this fall 22 administration would be where all kindergartners are required under the blueprint to take the KRA. That is happening right now, essentially. And so I'm not sure when that data will be available. So we'll follow up with MSDE on that question. But I think it becomes one of the big questions is what is the baseline? What baseline year do we want to use? And it's really a question of fiscal 22 or the 21-22 school year or the 22-23 school year. And for the KRA, because it wasn't given to all students before this school year, I think we would want to use the 22-23 data. That's a long answer. But that's just one measure, KRA. So essentially we kind of have to go through that process and thought process for everything.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what, and as we continue with the meeting and we talk more about phasing, I think we're also going to need to think about what is possible to include in this initial plan that we adopt December 1, and what pieces of it will come maybe next summer in the update when we have more data, baseline data, and we also will have the initial submissions, which can also include baseline data if it's data that is not regularly collected.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So Rachel, you sort of addressed my question, but I want a little more clarity. We've got nearly all students in the pillar out. Is language from the blueprint?
Nearly all.
Uh-huh.
It's from the commission report.
Okay, but I mean, did the blueprint set an expectation there? Did the blueprint have language on this point?
It doesn't specify that nearly all students means, for example, 90%.
But does it say nearly all, the blueprint? Or something like that?
It says something like that. It
So are you thinking that at some point this would be changed to say 80% or 90% or more? What is the expectation here? Because I think just to leave it as nearly all will, it's so subjective.
absolutely no.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the AIB needs to adopt what that means
Okay,
at full implementation,
right.
and then what your expectation is
Each year.
to
So
get to that point.
So for my own thinking, are you thinking that we would need to do that by December 1? Or is this something that would be addressed as we begin to move through the implementation?
I think as much as possible, if we can identify what it means at full implementation in the December 1 report, that would be
Okay.
ideal. And
No.
then work to get the baseline data and
Right.
establish
Right.
the intermediate.
So, that's going to require some pretty significant thought between now and December 1.
And when I say that, I'm referring only to the blueprint goals and the pillar
Right.
outcomes.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
not drilling down beyond that by December 1st.
I think Laura.
Yeah, just to follow up on that
Yeah.
point, Rachel, you had mentioned that we would come up with a target at full implementation,
Mhm.
then get kind of benchmarks where we are and figure out. I think we need benchmarks of where we are now.
In order to set the.
Yeah, if right now only 2% are
Mhm.
ready, then I think setting a goal of 95% is totally unrealistic in a matter of 10 years. So I do think we need benchmarks. You know,
Um,
yes, we want at least 95%, but or 90%. But I think we also have to recognize that there's realities here.
I think that's very fair, and I think it's also possible, because I say at full implementation, for the AIB to for the year that perhaps year 10 is not the year of full implementation in different places of the blueprint.
One other real quick question on this, Rachel. I know we need to move on, but
No, you're fine.
we all know that the college and career readiness standard is going to change because that's under review right now, and then we'll have a new college and career ready standard, which is going to drive everything in terms of curriculum, et cetera. So will the kindergarten readiness standard change? Or is that already well defined and known, and that's a level of readiness that is unlikely to change as a result of the college and career readiness standard? Does my question make sense to you?
It does make sense. It's a great question. I feel like it's less likely to need to change.
Yeah, I would think so. But if it were going to change,
but
then
it's possible. Yeah.
Looking at that complicates the benchmark question.
Yes, you're right.
If the kindergarten readiness standard is going to be higher in the future, then the current benchmark will be, we'll have to think that through. Anyway,
I'm glad you raised that. I honestly hadn't thought about that, at least not recently, and it's something we should definitely talk with folks who are experts in this area and get a sense of whether it might need to change.
Yeah. Oh, incidentally, I just note to everybody that our chairman has joined us, Ike.
How you doing?
Noted that you had another commitment and we're going to be a little late, so we're glad you're here.
Okay. I'll join in just a minute. I'm just get organized here. So.
Sure.
Okay. So we're just going to keep rolling here on our pillar 1 examples. So expected outcomes, and then the outcome measures that are going to be associated with those. And Dr. Stapleton was asking about the reference to year 10 and to use a specific year there instead, which I absolutely agree with. And so you can see the 3 measures that we're suggesting to look at: the overall KRA results, the gaps in readiness between student groups, and look that they are decreasing, and then also look at gaps between students who attend different providers. So, and the goal here is, as the high quality standards of the blueprint for full day pre-K are implemented, more student and the other early childhood supports, the more students, it shouldn't matter who the provider is over time. Students should essentially have very similar outcomes.
That begs a question. Is there a gap now between public and private providers?
There is.
In which it performs better?
The public providers.
Public provider. Okay, thank you.
And we can absolutely share that data with you. It's disaggregated by even, more than that, different types of provider. There are child care centers versus family home. So there's different types of private providers, and actually there's different type of public providers. There are school systems, there's Head Start. So we could share more of that information with you if you would like. So then moving down, the next section starts to get into the objectives of the pillar one. And so the first objective, unfortunately, is right at the bottom of the page there, is expanding high quality publicly funded full day pre-K. And actually, just before we move on, Dr. Kerwin, just to answer, we have been giving something, the KRA and the predecessor to the KRA, for 15 years now, I think. And over time, as we've been implementing more quality standards, the gap between the different types of providers has been closing. So we've already been making progress on that front. So I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, and so for objective one, which is expanding full day pre-K, we've got some expected outcome measures to look at here. And here we actually did put years. And so the first bullet there is the number of 3 and 4 year olds from low income families. Oh, right, this is in the law. So the number of 3 and 4 year old families enrolled in full day pre-K increases so that all low income 4 year olds who wish to enroll are able to do so by fiscal 26. That date is in the statute. And that low income 3 year olds are able to do so by fiscal 2032. That date actually is not in the statute, but that is year 10. And then the next item is all 4 year olds, regardless of income. So our mixed delivery sliding scale system are able to do so also by year 10 or fiscal 2032. And that the percentage of providers, both public and private providers, meeting the high quality standards increases annually, basically until we have enough providers to serve all the students who wish to enroll. So obviously that needs to be quantified. And then the last one is really trying to get at participation in the various programs and financial incentives that the state is offering to providers to meet the high quality standards, so that we achieve the bullets above sequentially. So those are the 4 measures that we're suggesting for pillar 1, objective 1 right now. And then if we scroll down, we get into the milestones and deliverables of pillar 1, objective 1. So just I'm saying that over and over again because that's how we're breaking this down. So we've got pillar 1, early childhood education, objective 1, expand full day pre-K, and we're drilling down. And so the milestones and deliverables you can see at the bottom of page 2. Hopefully they look familiar. They're straight out of the implementation graphic, but I do think this organization makes it a little clearer what the expectations are, and sort of how they sequence. And so the first item there is there's a memorandum of understanding that the LEAs are required to enter into with their private providers and MSDE. And that is beginning this year. And their draft MOU is actually required to be submitted as part of their blueprint implementation plan. So we'll be seeing those when in the March 15 submissions from the LEAs. And then we also have talked about the next item, which is the private provider participation minimum percentages that are in the statute. And the first target, if we want to call it that, but it is a requirement in the law, is that 30% of the pre-K slots or full day pre-K students would be served by a private provider. As we discussed in several of our work sessions, there is a waiver provision that for LEAs where they don't meet that target, the LEAs can submit a waiver request to MSDE, and that information is actually further below. And it's not stated right here. Dr. Stapleton?
Rachel, I have a very naive question about that component of the law, which I don't quite understand. I mean, why is it seen as an important thing to have at least 30% served by private providers? I mean, given that you know how the commission worked, you might have insight on that.
So essentially, when the commission was doing its work, they were very focused on building a mixed delivery system with public and private providers. Public providers being essentially the school systems, and then the private providers being the childcare providers that have been, that it's their business, it's their livelihood. And so the goal is to build a mixed delivery system that incorporates the private providers so that they still have their business model, but at the same time raising the quality standards so that we are having more and more students who actually come to kindergarten ready to learn. And so it was sort of a tension or a push-pull there. And so ultimately, the commission said that it should be 50-50. So half of the full day pre-K slots, we call them, should be for the 4-year-olds and low-income 3-year-olds should be provided by private providers, and half should be the public providers, essentially the LEAs. 50-50, and that goal was phased in over time. So it starts at 30% and it increases to 50% by fiscal 26, I believe, or 27. So it's a phase up, and it started at 30%. I mean, essentially it was to protect the childcare providers, so that the LEAs wouldn't be able to just say, we'll do it ourselves and sort of threaten their business model. So that was the reason for it. Of course, we're now in a place where the pandemic has created we're in a different place where we've lost childcare providers because of the economic conditions. And so that 30% is even harder to meet than it would have been.
Rachel, I think there was also another, you're right, it was the public, they didn't want the public to take over the business of the private providers, but there was equally a concern that we didn't have the physical space in the public sector to handle this large increase. I mean, this would have required a significant capital infusion in order to build the capacity for the public to do all of this. So, whether 50-50 was the right balance, who knows, but it was this trying to find the balance between the public sector can't do it all because they don't have the physical capacity, and we wanted to not take away the private providers' right to their business.
Absolutely. Yep. Fiscal 27, it's the last item there at the bottom of page 2. Yeah. So then the next section is the reports. And so, Emma, would you mind talking through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this section, we wanted to just make sure that we were identifying the key reports, of which you'll also see in a different section of the summary, but highlighting what is due and to who up front, along with the milestones and deliverables, but just in a separate section. So we have the date on the left side. In some cases, it's just due in a particular fiscal year, and we will also want to identify the exact date when it is due. And that might need to be something that the AIB just decides on. And a description of what the report calls for. And in some cases, specifically with the annual report that LEAs submit starting on December 1st, 2022, we have just requirements that need to go into the report, including identifying information related to the KRA. And you can just see the rest of the requirements that are on the right-hand side. So that would go into every section that actually has reports that an entity responsible for implementing part of the blueprint or an element of the blueprint needs to submit.
Great. And then actually, would you mind talking about the next table there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll look out for any hands. I can't really see just because I'm sharing my screen. So
I'll keep an eye on hands for you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks. We also wanted to identify key actors for each objective. So in this particular objective, again, this is all related to just 1.1, which is expanding pre-K expansion. So key actors here include LEAs, the State Department of Education, obviously, local departments of health and social services, which we'll get into in just a second, pre-K providers, obviously, and then the Interagency Commission on School Construction. And you can see all these entities in the next table, which should look a little bit more familiar based off of the colors here. We actually pulled the green from the implementation graphic on pillar 1. And if you recall, the first objective, everything that was in there was in green. So we're trying to make sure that that link is obvious between what's here in the table and then what's in the implementation graphic. So we've broken down the major subtasks and implementation requirements or guidance for implementation associated with objective 1.1, expand publicly funded full day pre-K. So within this table, and it is very long, and we're open to feedback on how to potentially reformat this to make it a little bit clearer. But we just have for each task, we've identified the task again. And then on the left side, we've named the major subtask. Again, this is pulled directly from the implementation graphic. And then on the right side, we have identified requirements or guidance for implementation. So there's a couple of things that I just wanted to point out quickly about how this is organized. We have put in bold the name of the agency or entity that's responsible for implementing this task or subtask, specifically the subtask. And then on the right-hand side, you'll also see that we have put in bold the words shall or may. If something is shall, that should be seen as a requirement. If something is in bold and it's like here it says LEAs may partner with state or county governments to address physical space constraints. That's a piece of guidance and is not an actual requirement for implementation. So we wanted to make sure that those were clear. But we've done this for each task associated with objective 1.1. And again, this is taken directly from the implementation graphic. So we've seen this content before. So I'll just really scroll through here and you can let me know if you guys have some feedback.
Emma, that's
Let me-
great.
Let me ask you here, is there any loop of feedback that we get back on the space needs? Because even if we assume a 30 or 50% breakdown of between private and public, there's still a pretty significant space need, I would think, from a number of the jurisdictions. Do we have any kind of feedback as to what that is in terms of scope and the number and location?
I know that the LEAs have been working on that and looking at that, and as part of their school construction requests to the Interagency Commission on School Construction, they should be identifying the additional space that they want to build or add. And those requests are due very soon to the IAC, so we should be able to get information from the IAC around what kind of pre-K space has been requested. I also I think some of the LEAs are also trying to figure out, again, it's sort of because we want this mixed delivery system. So how many spaces are they going to be able to count on from the private providers to determine how much space they might need to add on? And I would also just point out that there is we do know that, providers have gone out of business, and childcare space has particular requirements, like little things. And so there is an opportunity potentially for LEAs to lease space from that providers have potentially had to vacate, as a sort of a different way to think about finding the space rather than building it.
Okay.
Mr. Manko has his hand up.
Yeah, so first off, thanks for all the work putting this together. And I think the addition of the shall and the may, I think is really helpful and gives more definition on, particular things that absolutely need to be done and areas to focus on. To me, the way I read this, and maybe this is incorrect, but this is the what needs to be done. But in terms of the how this is going to get done, I presume that this is what the LEAs, what MSDE, what these different actors are going to articulate in their individual plans. Am I understanding that correctly? And if that's the case, then what is the guidance or expectations around those entities for what they need to submit or submit in terms of showing the how that they're going to meet each of these subtasks?
I think that's right. I think the how primarily comes from the LEAs and others who are going to be implementing the blueprint. I think technical assistance supports the how, and suggestions like this suggestion, or pointing out that the LEAs have the authority to lease space. So we're trying to sort of, particularly in this right-hand column, share things that might be helpful in figuring out the how. But for the most part, yeah, it's going to come in their plans. And we are, MSDE developed a template for the LEA plan submissions. And I mentioned earlier that we've been talking with MSDE staff around revisions to that. And we'll talk about phasing when we get to it here. And then in terms of for the other entities that will need to submit plans to the AIB, that's part of I think it's section 8 in the outline, which is what are the minimum requirements for the various plan submissions, and then also what MSD also developed draft criteria for success for the LEA plans. And so not necessarily in that format, but what will the AIB be looking for in the plans that are submitted by the other entities that will kind of constitute success or approval. And so that is still work that is under development.
Thanks.
Are there any other, do you want us to walk through the rest of this document, or we can move back to this PowerPoint? As Emma said, we're open to feedback on everything, but particularly if there are thoughts on how this table or the setup, to Mr. Manco's point, sort of the sharing of sort of guidance or, suggestions on the how, if you all have suggestions about how this could be more helpful, and also out in our internet verse, we're definitely open to that.
I mean, I'm sure you will hear this when this is what's great about having a process where you're doing a draft and we have some time to get feedback before the final submission comes in December. But, I presume one of the things that we're going to hear back in the feedback is just a sense of how lengthy some of these responses are expected to be. Because
What, Joe?
I think just length in terms of, because some of these subtasks, you could drone on and on forever and
Yeah.
go every single nuance. And I think they're going to want some guidance on what level of detail would be expected by the AIB and
Right.
their public stakeholders and such. But we'll probably hear that directly from them next week once the draft.
Yeah.
Well, and the AI, the blueprint law actually does, as part of the minimum requirements for the plans, the AIB is to set a maximum page length. And so we haven't talked about that yet, really, but a maximum page length for each plan. And then you may want to provide more guidance around, specific pillars or tasks, or, however you want to set up the minimum requirements and maximum length.
Can you talk through why it seems strange that they would come up with a maximum maximum length? There's a rationale around that, or? There is, and I would say it's the ghost of the Thornton master plans. And so the Thornton Commission that led to the 2002 law, that was the last big investment in education, K-12 education before the blueprint. Part of that law required the school systems to submit master plans to the State Department of Education for approval. And those master plans were essentially what the Thornton Commission was very focused on, revising the education funding formulas to reflect adequacy. We were already, the formulas were already designed to provide equity, although they also looked at equity. But the concept of adequacy and sort of what is the amount that is needed for students to be successful was sort of a new, wasn't a brand new idea at the time, but it was new to Maryland. And so that was in 2002. And so the master plans were really, the Thornton law did not provide actual education policies or practices that would support student success. It really was very focused on the student education aid structure. And so the master plans essentially were the way of accountability for how those funds would be spent. Prior to Thornton Commission, a good amount of the state's education funding aid was restricted
they were restricted grants that could only be used for certain purposes, and they had a lot of reporting requirements. What Thornton Formulas did is they made most of the funding unrestricted block grants. And then in exchange for that flexibility, the LEAs were to submit these master plans to provide the state with their plans for what they were going to do and how they were going to use the money to improve student achievement. The plans became enormous, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of submission. I think I can safely say nobody was happy with that, not the LEAs writing it or the folks who had to review them. And so
Under this time to learn from that endeavor and make sure that we have something that is rigorous, but also meaningful for everyone concerned.
So it is an unusual provision in the law to set, but it does specifically require the AIB to set a maximum page length. And that includes appendices.
I'm not, that's not one that I'm overly concerned with, because I think what we need to have something that is reasonable in response to the needs. And if the page limit is okay, but if something goes beyond that, that makes sense, we have to consider that's too rigid in my opinion. I think the intent in that portion was to make sure we have something that is reasonable, that we can have, you know, a certain number of pages, but to dictate there has to be exactly that number of pages on some of these things are easy to do. Some of them may take a little bit longer. So let's just be a little bit flexible about that.
So my interpretation of what you're saying, Mr. Chair, is that
that's
you're
what the law
thinking to set. You're thinking to.
That's what the law requires. But if someone comes in and says, you know, there are certain things that we need to put in here, and it takes us 2.5 pages or whatever it may be, as opposed to what you have a page long or something, we should use discretion and rationale to make a judgment about that. If you got something that's way over that, then that's a different question. But
yeah, I was just going to say, I think that lends itself to setting sort of an overall
right. Yeah.
goal of a page length, but not to give them flexibility that some sections might be longer and others might be shorter.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the way we look at it. That's part of rationality.
Absolutely. If there are no more questions on the this pillar 1 example, then I think we could go back to the PowerPoint if everyone's ready.
Rachel, just one thing I failed to mention before, you know, the dates, that there are some dates here in the subtasks, like you can see the establishing the sliding scale needs to be done on or before July 1st, 22. But, you know, just as a reminder, the implementation graphics, they still exist. Those will capture the timelines of when tasks need to be implemented. So that's part of why there aren't dates in here, that those graphics still do exist and include the timelines. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. And then, you know, we will have the milestones and deliverables and reports and those due dates up front, as we showed you earlier.
Thanks for sharing that, Emma, because I was contemplating on whether to ask about the dates, but then I said, okay, there's a fine line between being too prescriptive in one area. So I'm glad that you did mention that we could still, you know, we'll still have the graphics to guide us through the dates, but this will be sort of a guidance within the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tricky.
What do you want to go to?
I was just gonna say it was we didn't want to duplicate the entire implementation graphic again. So we kind of were sort of struggling with, you know, how much to repeat and how to organize it. So again, open to feedback on if something else is more useful. Great. So Emma has gone back to the PowerPoint, and the next slide, please. So we covered this before, but we'll cover it again here just for everyone. So we will be releasing sections of the draft plan over the next few weeks. There will be a feedback form that will be available on the AIB website, different from the form that you've been using to give feedback for the working sessions, that anyone will be able to submit comments, questions at any time through that form. And you can submit it multiple times, so you're not limited to, one feedback form. And then in addition, there will be a public hearing on Thursday, November 10th. The meeting will begin at 1 o'clock is the time. It's yet to be determined if we will have some board business that we might need to do first at 1 o'clock, and then start the public hearing with those sort of state agencies and entities and folks that want to provide feedback that are able to do that sort of during the working day. And then we would maybe take a break and then come back together in the early evening to hear from folks who aren't able to participate during the workday. So
one thing about that is that it starts off sequentially, but when you have a meeting trying to accommodate people at both time frames, we might have to go back if someone came in at night, could not participate during the day, to pick up a discussion that was held during the day. So we need to be flexible with this about that, because the reason they're coming at night because they couldn't do it in the daytime, and what they may have wanted to talk about was handled earlier. So we have to be a little bit flexible about that aspect of it. So make sure that people who come, for example, at night, they have the flexibility to discuss anything that's held at both points in time, if they did not participate earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we'll be sharing more specifics on the timing for the public hearing and how to register or sign up to testify and to submit written comments if you'd like.
And also encourage a written comment in advance, because that would make the meeting much more efficient. If those have comments that they can get to us earlier, greatly appreciate that.
Yeah. So we'll work on a mechanism for you to be able to upload written comments in advance of the meeting.
Okay.
Dr. Stapleton?
I just wanted to say I am so thankful that you are doing that, or that we are doing that, to have multiple time points. I think, the stakeholders in a lot of this are busy taking care of our kids. So thank you.
Yep, absolutely. All right, and then what do we have next? I believe we're going to talk about the phase submission. So as you all know, at the last AIB meeting, Superintendent Chaudhary presented his proposal for how the LEAs should submit their blueprint implementation plans over a period of time, rather than March 15th of 2023. And the first proposal from the superintendent involved having each pillar submitted at a different time. And so after that meeting, you all asked the AIB staff to work with MSDE staff and to develop a proposal that for your consideration that would not delay sections of the blueprint or entire pillars, but that would recognize the possible need to phase the plan submissions because it's a heavy lift, and as this slide shows, recognizing that the blueprint was delayed, due to the simultaneous actions of the veto and the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you know, we're still dealing with the impact of the pandemic on schools and learning loss. And the schools systems have been, managing through this crisis for the last, I guess we're into the third year of this. And, but also needing to recognize that what the pandemic has really shown is and exposed and exacerbated the very challenges and shortcomings of the education system that the blueprint is designed to address. And that LEAs, have already received some blueprint funding, sort of a down payment on the various aspects of the blueprint since fiscal 20. And beginning this fiscal 23, this current year, the significant increases in the blueprint formulas are coming to fruition. And so it's really critical that the school systems and also the other entities who are going to be developing blueprint implementation plans do so thoughtfully and strategically, but also as soon as possible for those parts of the plan that are already being funded and underway or will need to be implemented very soon. So working over the past 2 weeks, we have come up with a proposal that that we think is reasonable. It provides the additional time for certain pieces of the plans to be developed based on the sequencing of when the policies and practices should be implemented. So looking, if we zoom back to our implementation graphics and the visuals that really over the 10-year period really show what needs to happen when, to recognize that everything doesn't need to happen all at once in the beginning, and to phase the submissions so that those things that need to be addressed immediately would be addressed in the initial submission in March of 23. And that would cover the first 2 years. So fiscal 22 being sort of the baseline. Although, as we discussed earlier, in some cases, data for outcome measures will not be from fiscal 22. But so the initial submission in March of 23 would cover this school year and next school year. So anything that needed to be, and we're going to get into more specifics around this in a few minutes, but so anything that needs to be implemented in the blueprint in the next 2 years, or that they need to be planning to implement, would be covered in the initial submission in March of 2023. Then the following March, the additional items that would need to be implemented or plan to be implemented for the next 3 years would be covered, so that by March of 24, we would have a 5-year plan from every LEA around all of the blueprint. And then there would be, LEAs would have the opportunity to update their plans annually, and there would also need to be progress reporting around implementing the milestones and deliverables, and looking at the outcome measure data. And then there would be a second plan, a 5-year plan, that would be submitted in 2027, which would cover the second 5 years of the implementation period. So over the 10-year period, there would essentially be 2 5-year plans, which is very similar to what the superintendent was suggesting, but the phasing of the first plan is different than what was originally proposed by the superintendent. But we have been discussing this concept with him and his staff, and
let's go back 1 second. We have to make sure we are very clear on this point, because this is a major decision that we're about to at least tentatively make some recommendations on. Go back for just 1 second and for the record, explain the difference between this plan and what the superintendent originally suggested. And what are the major differences? Not everything, but the major difference in it. Just carefully go through that for us.
Sure. And Emma, if you could, thank you. So, so what we're proposing here is that we would ask the LEAs to include in their initial plans in March of 2023, their plans for each pillar. All 5 pillars are included in this proposal. And we would be asking them to cover those items within each pillar that are either underway now or will be implemented in the next 2 years, or that they need to plan to implement in the next 2 years. The superintendent's initial proposal was to phase it by pillar. So the first submission in March would, I believe, have focused on pillars 4 and 5 only. And then there would be another submission that would cover pillar 1, another submission that would cover pillar 2, and another submission that would cover pillar 3. Instead of doing it that way, which there are things in every pillar that are happening now or need to be planned to happen in the next year. And so, that certainly could be perceived as delaying implementation of parts of the blueprint, which is certainly no one's intent, including, I don't think, MSDE or the superintendents. And so this is really recognizing that there are pieces of the blueprint that, are sequential, and certain things can't happen until other things happen first. And so one example of that is the career ladder. So as part of pillar 2, the LEAs need to report on their career ladder, what their career ladder is going to look like and how it will be implemented. But they're in the process of, they're actually in the early stages of negotiating those career ladders now with their unions. And so they really aren't in a position to tell us yet what their career ladder will look like. What they can tell us is how they're approaching the negotiations, what their sort of non-negotiables, for lack of a better word, what their framework is, if any, beyond what the law requires the career ladder to cover, and then how they're going to include stakeholder input into the career ladder negotiations. And so we've literally gone through all of the blueprint and all 5 pillars and looked at what we think the LEAs need to include in their initial submission in March of 2023, and what can be included instead in the March 2024 submission. And I could give other examples.
Right.
And we do have another document that also will share that goes through all of the pillars, but I do see Dr. Kerwin's hand up.
Yeah, let's break for a moment and make sure that we are clear about the differences and what this does and does not do. You have some questions there now?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that I think this proposal makes very good sense to me. And what I like about it is that nothing gets delayed. We stay on track, given the initial delay that has already occurred, but we don't get any further delay. And moreover, these pillars are so mutually independent that I didn't like the idea of a plan for one pillar and then a delay on the plan for another pillar, which may be interacting with the first pillar. So this seems to me to address all the concerns that I had with the superintendent's proposal, most especially the fact that it keeps us on track.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Would you like us to, we can put up on the screen the objectives for each pillar and
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
we would suggest. And again, we did work with MSDE to develop this.
No, the question I have, I want you to go continue. The question I have was just on that basic point so that people understand generally what the differences may be. So go on. I didn't want us to get away
Sure.
from that, go to other things. So go ahead and finish your presentation.
Okay, great. You're gonna have to make that a lot bigger, Emma. There we go. Okay, and so what we have here is all 5 pillars broken down by the objective and then the task level. So it doesn't include everything in the implementation graphics. It doesn't go all the way down into the subtask and subtask. It's sort of the higher level summary. And you can see there's a description of it. And then the 3 columns to the right there is March 23. So that would be part of their submission in March 23. In the next column, it would be the March 24 submission. And then the 3rd column is in the 2027 submission. And so what we've done is marked yes or partial. And so if it's blank, that means no, just to be clear. And so just starting right from the top there, full day pre-K for 4-year-olds and low income 3 and 4-year-olds. That is something that is happening now. It's been being implemented for several years now. And so that is clearly something that we would want to see in LEA plans in their March of 23 submissions. But in the next row, expanding access to 4-year-olds between 300 and 600% of the poverty level, that is not something that is being implemented yet. That doesn't begin until fiscal 25. And so that is something that we don't need their plan for that right away. We could get that next March of 24 and still keep everything on track. And so that's literally what we've done for this proposal. So the next item is a high quality mixed delivery pre-K system. And so there are portions of the high quality requirements that are in place now. And there are portions that don't take effect until fiscal 26. So it says partial there because there are some parts of this task 3 that we would be asking the LEAs to report on in this submission, but other parts that they would not need to report on until March of 24. I mentioned the MOU that's required this year already, so that is a yes for the March of 23 submission. Again, in task 5 for pillar 1 is a partial because some of the high quality standards are not applicable yet. And so they would need to report on the parts that are and not and have another year to work on the other parts. And increasing the number of high quality pre-K providers and staff, obviously, that's something that needs to be, we have a shortage of providers and qualified staff. So that's something that we would expect to see a plan for how to implement that and how to increase the numbers in the March of 23 submission. And then below that is the KRA, which we've discussed already, is being administered to every single incoming kindergartner this school year. So that is something that we would want to see in the March of 23 submission. And then there are duty centers that are funding is being provided and has been for several years now to increase the number of duty centers. And so we would want to see a plan for how they would propose to locate and support new duty centers in their March 23 submissions. And I should let me say a couple of things. One is that, so in order, what we've done is we've isolated those tasks that LEAs have to implement. So there are other things in Pillar 1 that MSDE, for example, has to implement, but those are not shown here because the LEAs don't have to report on those tasks. So the list is not as long as, it's still long, but it's not as long as the entire pillar graphic because it is not, it is isolating what the LEAs need to do from what other entities and agencies need to do. And then the other thing is, you can see for Pillar 1, they're going to need to report on pretty much something in almost every task. And so Pillar 1 is an example of, there are things that are already underway, and so not as much of it is dependent on other things needing to happen. And so there are the plans will include a lot around Pillar 1. As we move down, that's not the case in every pillar. So it's also reflects the sequencing of the pillars, which is different between pillars. Dr. Stapleton?
Yep, thanks, Rachel. You mentioned that this is for the LEAs. Are you also thinking about phase timing for other?
Yes, essentially the same concept of looking at what is the sequencing of the blueprint and the timing of the blueprint and what is needed in the initial March 23 submissions versus March 24 and then 2027. Yes, exactly. So if we sorry, somebody, no. If we move on to Pillar 2, then sort of we can there are more things that are dependent on other activities in Pillar 2, and so less items that they will need to include in their March 23 submission on parts of Pillar 2. So starting with 2.1 in row, I guess that's 41 there, monitor the quality and diversity of state teacher candidates and existing teacher workforce. Clearly, that's an urgent issue, and we would want the LEAs to report on their plans on that front in the March 23 submission. Revising the teacher prep programs to meet requirements and the LEA's participation in working with the teacher prep programs on those various subtasks, because those requirements are not required for several more years until July 1 of 2025 or fiscal 26. That is something that would not need to be in this initial submission, but we did we did put a yes in the March of 24, because in order for the teacher prep programs to have, enough partner schools and mentor teachers to support the practicum and other teacher prep requirements, we can't wait until fiscal 25 to plan all that. So we did put the yes in that March 24 submission. Annual training on behavioral health in the row 48. It is an annual requirement. And so we would want some information on that in the 23 submission. Again, comprehensive induction program in the next line is a good example of sequencing. And so MSDE is required to develop guidelines for the new induction programs that are required by the blueprint. And then after that, the LEAs are required to implement the new induction program. So in this case, we don't want to ask the LEAs to give us a plan for how they're going to implement a new induction program when MSDE first has to actually develop the guidelines around what these new comprehensive induction programs should look like. So for the LEAs, there is a blank in the March 23 submission because they wouldn't be able to report on that yet. But for MSDE's plan, for example, there would be a yes in that column because we need the MSDE to move forward with developing guidelines for the new induction program so that the LEAs can work on how they're going to implement it. The next item relates to essentially it relates to the career ladder. And again, because the career ladder is not in place yet, it is blank for the March 23 submission. The next item is the support program for national board certified teachers. And obviously we want that's something that needs to happen immediately so that we have more and more teachers who, if they choose to do so, will be able to join the career ladder when it is up and running. The next item is specifically about implementing the career ladder. And there's a partial there, as the example I gave earlier. They can tell us how they're planning to approach a career ladder, sort of what principles or what framework they're looking at that might be beyond what the state's requirements are, because the state law does set what the minimum requirements for career ladders must be. And so that is the partial in March of 23. They would need to tell us how they're approaching it. I think, whether they're going to create a career ladder development committee, which is, they're not required to do it, but they may choose to do that. And then in March of 24, they would need to actually provide their draft career ladder, because that would need to be implemented beginning July 1 of 2024. And the next item relates to professional development tied to the career ladder. And again, similar to the induction program, MSDE is actually tasked with designing the professional development system that the LEAs will then implement. And so they would not need to do anything on that in this first submission in March of 23, but they would need to provide information on how they're going to implement the new professional development system in their March 24 plan. And as with the other example on the induction program, MSDE will have a yes in that column, because they will need to be working on what this new professional development system will look like in order for the LEAs to work on a plan to implement it. And The next item is the teacher evaluation system tied to the career ladder, same logic there. The next item relates to the implementation of the collaborative and non-instructional time in the schools, which is also partly tied to the career ladder. And so that is something that we thought, because they do have a lot of other things that they are focused on, that is something that they could provide in the March of 24 plan, but would not need to provide in the first plan in March of 23. And I won't read everything to you. You can see at the bottom, the last item there relating to the implement the minimum 60,000 starting salary by July of 26. We put a partial there because it is also tied, many of them, their strategy is tied to the one above it, which is the 10% salary increase for teachers by the end of fiscal 24. So that is obviously a yes in that row, and then a partial related to the starting salary, so that they could talk about how they're approaching incorporating the, or not, the 10% into the getting to the minimum 60,000. So that's pillar 2. Are there any questions on pillar 2? Okay, so pillar 3 is one that has a lot of yeses, but it's sort of a caveat, because as we know, and as the vice chair brought up earlier, there is a study that will be underway soon, hopefully, to look at what the updated CCR standard should be. That study is due to be completed in September of 2023. And so for everything that is related to CCR in the March 24 submission, it would be based on the interim CCR standard, the standard that we're using now. And then in the March 24 submission, hopefully, although that might be ambitious, they would be reporting on all of these things relative to the updated CCR standard. And so starting in row 88 there, assess students no later than 10th grade for meeting the CCR standard. That is using the interim CCR standard and assessing students based on our current assessment tools. It's already happening. And so that would need to be part of the March 23 submission, and providing intervention services for students who are not on track to becoming CCR by the end of 10th grade. So we would be asking them to provide what their plan is based on the interim CCR standard to begin to provide these services to students who need them now. The next row, 98, relates to the supplemental services and funding that was provided through to address pandemic related learning loss. And in another place, there's behavioral health funds that were provided to the LEAs. So that would need to be part of their March 23 submission, but unless funding is extended, there would not need to be any plan for that in the subsequent submissions. The next item is the ninth grade tracker system, which they're already implementing this school year. So that is a yes. The next item relates to in row 105, the CCR support pathway. And again, we would be asking them to provide their plan for how they are going to address the needs of students who, under the interim CCR standard, are not CCR at the end of 10th grade. Dr. Doss, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Pillar 3 is a bit challenging. And I was hoping not to see as many yeses at the beginning for Pillar 3. So we're still working with the interim CCR standard. And in some instances, it sounds like, okay, so we can just move ahead. We're working with the interim, we're fine. But then I'm thinking, what happens when we do come up with something different? And it may not, it may not change things as much as I'm thinking, but we do come up with something different. So do our LEAs have to go back and then report on how they're doing this again with the new standard? Or go ahead, I'll just leave it like that.
Okay, I think that what we're asking them is to tell us in this initial plan how they're going to serve students now who are either college and career ready or not college and career ready, and what they're doing, what plans they have for the next school year to begin to provide the CCR support pathway and the post CCR pathways for students who are college and career ready at the end of 10th grade. Once the updated CCR standard, if it is updated or whatever affects that, then we would be asking them to look at how an updated CCR standard affects, and first MSTE would need to look at their standards around all pre-K to 10th grade, basically. What are the standards and are they aligned to what the updated CCR standard is, and whether any adjustments needed to be made. And then the LEAs would be asked to look at their curriculum and update that if needed to reflect the updated CCR standard. And then all of that would then potentially affect the numbers of students who are participating in the CCR support pathways, the post CCR pathways. So it we wouldn't be asking them to do things over again per se, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, there's still a lot of unknowns.
There definitely are. And they say yes. In column F, in row 88, it says partial. And so, maybe it's more helpful if it says partial, because it's only reflective of the interim standard and not the updated standard. So that might be one change that we want to make to better reflect that we're not expecting everything to be done over again, because that's definitely not the expectation in what we're proposing.
Okay.
Any further questions?
Pillar 4 also has a good number of yeses. So I just do want to point out that Pillar 3 stops at row 121. So there are a lot of yeses, but Pillar 4 also has a fair number of yeses. And really, this really reflects the fact that the new funding formulas for English learners, for special education, for concentration of poverty grants, and compensatory education. The money, you know, there has been funding flowing for a couple of years, and now the new formulas are increasing further. And so asking them to provide information on how they're implementing the English learner work group recommendations, how they're going to be using their English learner funding to increase student achievement. Same thing for special education. You know, all of these things are underway now, and they need to report on that. But I do want to make sure something is clear. The March 23 submission would only be required to cover 2 years, not just 2 years. So it would need to cover the current school year and the next school year. And then the March 24 submission would cover the next 3 years. And then the July 27 submission would cover the last 5 years. So we're not asking for a 10-year plan by March of 23 for anything. It's just the next 2 years that would need to be covered in the March 23 submission. In Pillar 4 there, trying to see what else I want to focus on. The behavioral health supports, we would want a plan from the LEAs in terms of how they're implementing best practices around student health and behavioral health, which they've been doing a lot of that as they're addressing the pandemic related trauma and learning loss. And then Pillar 5 really is submitting their implementation plans. I think there's more around data reporting and financial reporting in Pillar 5 that isn't specifically laid out in the pillar graphic right now. So we're going to do a little more thinking on Pillar 5 and specifically what information may be needed to be submitted under that pillar. And so this is what this is what we're bringing to you for your consideration.
Right. Hey, before we get to that and get reaction from the board, I know that you were in consultation and working collaboratively with the superintendent and his staff. I'm not asking whether or not everybody's in agreement with this approach. We have to make a decision on our own about where we go with this. But are we clear that everybody fully understand what this means and there's no misinterpretation about what is required and what is in this particular option? Those are two different, separate questions from disagreement versus I understand what is being proposed and we're clear about what is being proposed here. So that we don't get back a month from now and someone says, oh, I didn't understand it that way, or there's a misinterpretation of what you said, versus I disagree. I'm not asking about disagreement. I'm asking about, is there a clear understanding of what we have here between the various parties? I've lost you there. Are you there?
Yes.
You hear the question?
I don't see any hands.
No. The question that I raised.
You, Rachel.
So you're asking me if there are any misunderstandings between.
No. Yeah, not with the board. I'm asking whether or not in your deliberation and collaboration with the various staff of the board and superintendent, that there's a clear understanding of what this option is requiring, so that we don't get to a point of someone saying a month from now, I didn't understand this is what that meant, so that we are clear about that. I'm not asking whether or not there's a disagreement about whether we should do it or not do this according to this time frame, but whether or not people fully understand what this is required, and that we don't get a challenge of definition or time or something else that someone says, well, we didn't understand it that way.
So I'm hesitant to speak for MSDE staff, but we've spent many hours working through the.
Well, let me rephrase the question. Were there any questions raised to you of misunderstanding of what this required?
No, I think that we have a common understanding of this proposal in terms of identifying what is reasonable and what to expect the LEAs to be able to submit in March of 23. We didn't spend as much time on the March 24 and July 27 pieces of it, but we did discuss it, but we didn't go into as much detail as that. And so I feel for the March 23 submission, I think we definitely have a common understanding. That being said, the devil is in the details, for lack of a better way to put it. And in order to carry this concept through, if you all agree to it, we will need to be working, we've already begun working with MSDE on specifically walking through their proposed template and also the criteria for success to reflect this phased concept. And so we will need to have a lot more discussions with them around what would be included in the template for March of 23, and then what those criteria for success would be. But I do think we have a common understanding on this concept.
Okay. All right, then we will double back just to be sure, because I do not want to come back and later on as we are moving forward, we have an opportunity because this is a draft, and further collaboration and discussion with them to make sure that everybody fully understands what this is required. Are there any questions from the board members about this? Okay, is there anything else?
I don't have a question, but I think it would be interesting to know what the general reaction is from board members, if they are supportive of this approach or not.
I was about to call for a motion so we'd have.
Oh, good. All right.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to call for a motion because this is a proposal provided by our staff that we take this phase timeline for our approach to the comprehensive plan with all of the caveats of having this as a draft for further deliberation and discussion, which often means that at some point we can change this as we go to the deliberation with the public and any and all other entities that may want to comment on this. This is basically the formal approach to this with the caveats that I've just indicated, subject to reaction to the draft from the public and others who may have some either corrections or request changes to what we've suggested. Is there a motion to that effect?
Also,
A second to it?
I second.
All right, been moved and second. Now it's open for discussion.
Well, since nobody's talking, I'll talk.
All
I've lost my ability to use wait time in the classroom. I think this threads a fine needle or line to trying to acknowledge the stress that the LEAs are under and other agencies are under, as well as pushes things forward. So I do appreciate the work that has been done. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more work to be done to make this happen. But I'm comfortable with this approach.
Okay. Any further discussion?
Right. I just want to acknowledge the enormous amount of work that went into preparing this alternative approach and in a relatively short period of time. So, Rachel, my hat is off to you and your staff for being able to produce this.
I concur with that, Brett, and I also want to thank the superintendent and his staff for working with Rachel as well. We may have a slight difference approach, but I think that we're all moving in the same direction in terms of a positive outcome. Hopefully, we will be on the same page as we go forward to implement this in the spirit of cooperation. So I want to thank the superintendent and his staff as well, but certainly Rachel and her entire staff. So therefore, no further questions. I'm going to call for the vote.
I have one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You know, and I guess I'm just wondering what, so is the sense that we're going to vote on whether to move forward with this timeline right now, or does it make sense? Is this one of the things that we are seeking feedback from the LEAs and stakeholders in the public hearing phase? It seems like once the LEAs have the draft plan in front of them and are able to kind of go through and identify what the enormity of the tasks that they have in front of them, they would be better positioned to provide some feedback on whether, a phased approach is manageable, or if this is just going to be, just too momentous of a task. But I don't know. I guess I feel like we're going through and making a decision without necessarily getting the feedback of the people.
No. Let me correct that.
Okay.
As I said, with the caveats that I just outlined, this is to accept this as a draft proposal, subject to the open sessions, feedback from everyone else. So you get an opportunity later on to draft the resolution from this. So that's not what you're doing today. But we need to give staff direction to say, this is the direction we're going, subject to all of those caveats that you and I have just mentioned.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
And if I could just add to that, and depending on the vote, then what we would do is continue working with MSDE staff to identify which parts of the template and which parts of the criteria for success would be part of the March 23 submission, and provide that. The superintendent and I had talked about a goal of by the end of the month, by the end of October, so that the LEAs would have all that information and be able to provide more informed feedback on the drafts at the public hearing. And
got it. I apologize for my misunderstanding.
No, I'm sorry. We will not take a final vote until after we've had the public hearing, feedback from all the various parties we've talked about. This is to just give direction. The formal vote for acceptance or rejection of this will come a little bit later on. Okay? All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposition? Hearing none, the direction to the staff is so noted. We'll get a draft back and we'll go through the process of looking at all of the responses there too, and hopefully in the time frame that's outlined, we'll be able to take a final vote at some time in the near future. Okay.
that is the end of the public agenda. If there aren't any other comments or discussion.
All right, we have, I think we are, if none, we'll adjourn in the private session executive session. So we need the appropriate motion. Can you read that for us and how we're to connect to the executive session?
Yes. So the motion would be to adjourn to executive session in accordance with the Open Meetings Act related to administrative functions. And the meeting would then be adjourned at the conclusion of the closed session.
All right. We have a vote on that. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposition? None? Okay. We'll now take 5 minutes. We'll go into, no, I'm sorry, take 10 minutes. We'll go into executive session.
Mr. Vice Chair, did you want to say something? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Britt, were you asking a question?
Graham, can you unmute him?
Sorry, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yeah, Ike, I just wanted to make note of the passing of a very important person, Betsy Brown Rootsey, who was a vice president at NCEE. And as I mentioned, a couple of colleagues that probably many of you don't know that name, but she was so instrumental in the work of the commission and in the crafting of the blueprint as an advisor to Rachel. She attended every commission meeting. She was there to provide guidance and counsel and support. And I think I can honestly say that the report of the commission would not have been of the quality it was without Betsy's work. And in addition to that, she was just a beautiful human being. And so all of us who knew her were touched by her or deeply saddened by her tragic passing. But I just want everybody to know how critical she was in getting us to where we are at this moment. Her name's not on anything. She gets no credit in the press or anything like that. It's most unfortunate because she was a rock and just a font of wisdom and support as we went through our work. And we're just, all who know her are going to miss her deeply.
Thank you for the Brett, and I certainly appreciate the hard work that she provided and the work that she's outlined for us to go forward with. And in that spirit, we will join in that recognition of her service to the AIB and the blueprint and all the work that they performed. Thank you for that recognition.
Thank you.
All right, we'll now stand adjourned. 10 minutes from now, we'll just make it at 3:40.